Well, good day to everybody. Welcome to our monthly episode of Calmly Considered here at Faith Seeking Understanding University. I am Allan. I am pastor, retired, professor, Bible moth, theologian in exile, and peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a university completely made up, where our sports teams every week have bye weeks, and where and if we ever field a team, it'll probably be shuffleboard. Anyway, and my conversation partner, as always, is Michael Cruz, who comes to us from Kansas City, Missouri, and who is a lover of sports and Kansas City barbecue. Hey, Mike, what is Kansas City barbecue, actually?
What is Kansas City barbecue? It's a particular, I think it's a tomato-based barbecue.
Okay.
And it originated largely, I think, in the sort of the mid-Atlantic states, probably came out of North Carolina, eventually Tennessee and Kentucky. I think that's where a lot of people came from.
Yeah.
I think back in those areas, it tended to be more pork, but with Kansas City and its beef industry, with the cattle drives and so on here, it sort of, I think, elevated the beef part of barbecue.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think it tends to be a little more of a, I'm not sure what the right word is, kind of a tangy taste, often with the sauces and the rubs and stuff that they put on it. Not necessarily hot and super spicy like you might get with some Texas barbecue,
right,
things like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Well, anyway, I mean, I love barbecue. I love any kind of barbecue. Boy, I'll tell you what. I made a comment on social media, I don't know, 3-4 weeks ago, saying that my favorite barbecue, and I haven't met barbecue I haven't liked, but my favorite barbecue is Eastern Carolina, which is vinegar-based barbecue. Boy, I'm telling you what. I tell you what, there's 3 things never to talk about at the table: religion, politics, and barbecue. It is. Right. I'm serious. It is serious stuff.
It's a big rail. That's right.
I know. I hear you.
Go there.
I hear you. Anyway, so we got to get to our subject. We're going to for this month skip our little conversation on sports, which some of our listeners probably will appreciate. But it's our show. We get to do what we want. And
that's right.
But another good game yesterday. And we need to talk a little bit about the post-election, just briefly, because you and I talked. That was our subject last month. So as I recall, that we both made predictions that were always tentative, because that's always a dangerous thing to do. We both predicted that the Democrats would keep the Senate, and it looks like that's the case.
Right,
isn't it?
Sure does.
I don't know how huge of a deal that is, Michael, to be honest, in the Senate, because I mean, it means that the Republican leadership can't try and stymie Biden. But the reality is, in the Senate, you got to have a 60-vote majority, and their rules, to me, I think their rules make a place where deliberation goes to die, to be honest. When one senator can block stuff. So, I mean, it's an important victory if you're a Democrat, but I'm not so sure it's a huge deal in the big picture of things. If the Democrats had 60 or 65 seats, that would be a different story. What do you think?
Well, I think there is the issue of appointing court justice
Good
judges
point.
for the courts, and so they keep that. My understanding is that they plan to appoint 58 federal judges next month, that those have been through the Judiciary Committee.
Right.
And I think through the next 2 years, they anticipate that Biden could appoint as many or more judges as Trump did in his 4 years.
Well, that's a good point.
So if they didn't have the Senate, they wouldn't be able to do that. The other thing is that, whatever the craziness that the House may propose in their legislation will die in the Senate, because they have a Democrat majority. So it does put a check on it from that standpoint. But you're right. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. I did hear one analyst talking about the Georgia issue. Is it a big deal whether or not they win Georgia now? And he was sort of suggesting that, it still is a big deal. And he said part of the reason is that in a lot of the Senate committees, because the Senate is split exactly 50-50, their committees are split exactly 50-50 in a lot of these. And so, and they've done this a couple of times, Republicans just walk out of a committee and keep it from functioning. in order to stop that from happening. And they have to go through some hoops in order to get stuff done that they need to get done because they can't get it through the committee. If you have 51 versus their 49, then the Democrats always have the majority in each of the committees. They
Right.
can, so they, so it would help smooth, and that's a small thing, but he was still saying that it's an issue. Had the Democrats been able to keep the House, of course, this would be a really big
Right.
thing, but that's where we're going next. And I think when we talked, I suggested last time we talked that I thought that the Republicans were going to narrowly keep the House, and that looks to me like they're probably going to get 2 to 3 votes, 2 to 3 positions,
Right.
To keep the majority for the
Yeah, that's what I had said too. And but it's still, and of course that's different in the House, because if you just have a 1 vote majority, you're in control. But it still is kind
exactly.
of, it still is not exactly. I mean, by all accounts, and historically, the Republicans, I mean, as they say, it should have been a red wave, but it was more like a ripple.
Yes.
And one of the things that heartens me in this, and I don't mean heartened by which party wins and which party doesn't, but that, you know, I've been very clear. I think you've also been clear that this whole big lie of election denial has been a real scourge, and it's been a terrible thing. And the American voters, even though it wasn't a wild majority, American voters basically said, we don't want that. We don't,
Right.
we're not going to, you know, I found that I was reading this morning, the only office where election denier won, and it was Attorney General in Wyoming. And I thought, well, Wyoming is so red, that doesn't even matter anyway.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Right.
so,
Right.
and so, you know, a recent poll, you know, and 80% of swing voters said, look, at 2020 was a fair election.
Yeah.
And so the American people said, we don't want this nonsense. We don't want, we don't want to be fighting every election. We want to be able to vote. I thought that was a good sign.
Right. I do too. I think it's very good. All those secretaries of state and governor candidates and so on that were running on that topic, it looks like all of them have lost. The one in Georgia, the governor has not been called yet, but it looks pretty likely that Carrie Lake's going to lose. So I think that is the most positive thing. And you know, we're talking, you were saying a second ago, you know, this is just a narrow victory. It wasn't a blue wave either. But I do think that looking historically, if you look at the historical patterns, all things being equal, this should have been a massive red wave. With Biden at 44% approval rating, inflation at a 40-year high. I mean, you can list off all the stuff. This should have been the Republicans picking up 25, 30, 40 seats in the House of Representatives, and it looks like they're going to flip less than 10. And then they couldn't take the Senate at all.
Yeah.
And so I do think that because that is the standout from any other, they talk about there's 2 or 3 midterms, I think, where presidents actually did sort of retain their control or kept away from happening. But the times that happened, the president at that point had extremely high approval ratings. It was like right about the time of the Gulf War for George Bush. I think it happened once, and then Kennedy right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. So you have people patriotic and rally around the president, you know, type events. Biden had 44% approval rating, and the Republicans couldn't crack this.
Yeah, and his inability, at least from this, my opinion, was his inability was to just talk honestly about the economy and to empathize, sympathize with voters. I was listening to him talk about him just minimizing everything. He said, "Come on, Joe. You know, this is not where people are. Be honest. Tell them the truth. Tell them what you want to do, but just say, inflation's not good."
Right. Yeah. Right.
You know, and so the messaging was terrible for the Democrats too. So, well, as somebody once said, you know, the American people sometimes will experiment with crazy, but they're not going to continue to go back and vote for it. And to be honest, we've had a few years of crazy. And Liz Cheney, best quote, says that this was a vote for Team Normal. Let's go back to normal. I told somebody I want to vote for, I mean, I'm a swing voter, so I vote Democrat, I vote Republican. I want to have normal Republicans to vote for again.
Right.
That's been my big frustration.
Yeah.
So anyway. All right. Well, enough of that. We'll talk in 2 more years, because probably before that, because, you know, everybody announces soon.
I guarantee you, there's at least 2 more years of a lot of crazy to come. So.
Oh,
yeah.
we're not done with crazy. Oh, yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah.
We may have reached the end of the beginning of crazy, but we are nowhere near the middle of crazy or the end of crazy.
Crazy never goes down without a fight.
Yeah,
So, all right.
That's right.
So here's our topic for today. It is November. We're coming upon the Christmas season. As we know, the Christmas season starts November 1st. When you and I were growing up, Michael, the Christmas season started the day after Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And now Thanksgiving is sort of like a hiccup on the way to Christmas, right?
Right.
And, so everything starts now. And of course, shopping. And so today our subject is, should Christians participate in Black Friday? But we've got some bigger fish to fry here, not just that day. But so let me tell you my own little journey with Black Friday. First of all, I hate Black Friday personally. I don't like crowds. I always say I don't like crowds anywhere but church. Right. And my wife and I experimented with Black Friday many years ago. Our daughters were older teenagers, so we could leave them with our boys, and we went out really early, and we said, we did that and said, nah, that ain't ever happening again. But there are people who love it. I have friends who love it, and they make it a family thing every year, and right. But when I was a younger pastor, I liked to rail against Black Friday because it just struck me of materialism and greed and just so many things that Christmas really isn't about, because Christmas, of course, is the story of God's self-giving to us. And as I got a little older as a pastor, I began to mellow out a little bit. Maybe it's because, you get older and you just mellow out. But when you begin to read and do some drilling down, and for example, it's called Black Friday because this is the season, right, when a lot of businesses end up in the black. They run a deficit all year. Right. And then Black Friday comes around, and I want businesses to thrive and survive, because if that happens, then people have jobs, and everything is better. And so I've kind of mellowed out on that. I have to tell you, I still have kind of a love-hate relationship with it, because there is something about it that seems, from a Christian perspective, at least from my perspective, there's something about it that doesn't sit well with me. But I don't go on any tangents anymore on social media about it. What are your thoughts as we get into this conversation?
Well, this is just my personal preferences. I'm not making this a moral argument one way or the other for things. I'm not a big fan of Black Friday either. You've heard the joke about there's two kind of people in the world, avoid both of them. That's kind of my feeling on crowds. Yeah. I'm not a big Black Friday fan. I think once, years and years ago, I went to a store on the Friday afternoon of a Black Friday because I was compelled to. I had to go get something that had broken, and so I had to get that. And I think that was my one experience with shopping on Black Friday. And Melissa and I, we don't exchange presents for Christmas, and we don't have kids, so we're not buying for kids. We just never been really big into the whole gift buying stuff and doing the stuff on Black Friday. And just as a personal preference, like I said, I'm not big on crowds. Like you, I think there are theological, spiritual questions that I think need to be reflected on when we think about participating in these cultural events that occur, economic events. I like you, I know some people that really get a big kick out of that and going and doing things. I think they're good, decent, caring people who have compassion for others and give money generously to other people, that type of thing. But it's still something that they love doing. So I don't know that participating in Black Friday is the ultimate corruption against being able to live a godly life and service to God. But I do think, as with many things in our culture, it's something that you can participate in, but it has to be done intentionally and reflectively in terms of what we're thinking, how it's going to affect us spiritually. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's well said. You talked about you guys not buying a lot of gifts and things. It's interesting because one of the things we get into later on when we get talking about the issue of Christians, and we're going to talk about Foster's book, Freedom of Simplicity, and talk about simplicity. you know, I have never and I'm not saying this for altruistic reasons, you know, that, you know, I'm so sacrificial, but I've just never been into stuff. And just,
Right.
it's just kind of
Yeah.
my makeup. Now,
Yeah.
I say I have two luxuries in life: books, which is not really a luxury, and tickets to the baseball game.
There you go.
Right? Those are my two luxuries in life. Okay. Oh, by the
Yeah.
way, and good coffee and drinking good
Yeah.
coffee. That's it. It's just part of me, and maybe it was the way
Yeah.
we were raised. We didn't have a lot growing up, and you know, we have relatives when we were still do that when married that stunned that my wife and I really didn't buy each other Christmas gifts.
Yeah.
And
Right.
people would say, "Well, why not? You know, why you guys aren't buying?" And we said, "You know, we got lots of stuff. We're blessed already, and
Yeah.
we
Right.
have a great marriage and a great family, and so we just don't look. I mean, there's stuff I see I would like to have, but we don't.
Right.
You know, so that's sort of driven how we have been. We bought presents for our children. We didn't go whole hog. We thought there was something to be said about Christmas not being viewed. I mean, kids love Christmas, and I get that. But,
Sure. Yeah.
you know, so that's just kind of where we were. So maybe part of my, I don't know, reason for thinking this way is just because stuff's never been a big deal to me.
Right. Right. And so, that's the thing that's always the easiest to get the most haughty and spiritual about is stuff that doesn't tempt us, and we don't do it. Therefore, we're spiritually superior because we,
Right.
because we're not tempted by it. For
Right.
somebody who really is
Yeah.
into that, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a struggle. Well, it's real easy to be condemning them. Well, I don't do that. Well, I don't have any
Yeah.
motivation to do that.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of other temptations that come our way. So
There you go.
Right. It
Exactly.
isn't just, yeah. So,
Right.
you know, so what is one person's what is one person's temptation and is another person's eh. So
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I want to be careful about that. But maybe I'm trying to think as we're reflecting on this, is that maybe
Yeah.
for me it's just because I've never been motivated by money. I
Yeah.
mean, I like money. We need
Yeah.
money,
Right.
but it's just not something that's big. So anyway, okay.
Yeah.
But look, you know, yeah, people want to buy presents and they want to be generous with other people at Christmas time, and they want to get gifts for the people they love and care about. Nothing wrong with that, is there?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So that's a good thing. But again, as you say, let's be reflective on some of this. And I guess that's what's kind of gets me about Black Friday, because it just, you see videos and it looks like a free for all. And
Yeah.
And that is, I guess, what gets me. I mean,
Right.
everybody in line to get the hottest toy, of which the store purposely only stocks 5,
Right.
in order to get you there and hope you'll buy other things. And there's just something unseemly about that the focus is not on the gift giving per se, it's on the gift itself.
Right. And I guess one of the things I would reflect on is, if you're participating in Black Friday and you come away at the end of your adventure and you're feeling uplifted and you feel like you had fun and it was good to be with family and do stuff like that, that's one thing to reflect on. If you're going to Black Friday after Black Friday and when you're done, you're resentful of other people, you think it's terrible, you know, why are you participating in it?
Right. That's a good point.
If it's tearing you down and it's defeating you, then what is your motivation for what's driving you to go do those things? So I think it requires us to be reflective of our motivations. We often say that we need things. There's Ivan Illich, I think, wrote a book yesterday, several years ago, that was something about the language of need. And so we'll walk into McDonald's and say, well, I need a Big Mac and fries. No, you don't need a Big Mac and fries. You want a Big Mac and fries. And so that becomes about being reflective about, okay, so I want this. I don't need this. Is this relative to the other things that I'm dealing with in my life right now? Is this a good move to do this? And it may very well be. A Big Mac and fries is fun to eat and it's tasty if you like that stuff. And so it can be okay, but to always cast everything about a compulsion if it's a compulsion to participate in
Yeah.
things there, I think some reflection is needed. Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting dangerously in dangerous waters now, because you're hinting that I don't need my morning coffee. I'm not sure I feel about that, Michael. But
That's borderline, you know.
But it really is a good question. Here's the thing I want to say. One of the other things I want to say about this: when you live in an affluent culture like we do, it doesn't mean everybody in our culture is doing good in society, and there aren't people struggling to make ends meet. There are a lot of people. Okay.
Right.
But when you live like I live, and I live a comfortable life,
Yep.
I'm not rolling in money, but I'm also, not hurting either, and not, I'm doing okay. When you live in that kind of context, first of all, you talk about needs. It can be very difficult to separate wants from needs, right?
Yes. Right.
That becomes the problem. If we rationalize something we want long enough, a want becomes a need. So discernment is hard on that.
Right.
And the other thing, I think sometimes that maybe it can express a little bit of unacknowledged, I'll admit, unacknowledged ingratitude in my heart. When I think about my friends in other countries where I've been, who actually are not quite sure where the food's coming from for the next week.
Right.
And would love to, and would love to afford to get their child just one toy.
Yeah. Right.
And so, and I know those cultures aren't ours. It's different. I'm trying not to compare here apples to oranges. It's just a reminder to me. And I think when you live in a culture of plenty, and I don't mean it in the word that you object to as an economist, scarcity. I don't mean it in that way. If you're not sure, folks, what that is, we have a previous podcast you can listen to.
Yeah.
But I mean, when we live in a world where what I want is at my fingertips.
Right. Yeah.
It can be hard to ask those critical questions.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Keeping that sense of gratefulness, of awe at what you have and in your life. That's the challenge, is that the tendency when we're around it so much is that we become numb to what it is, and then that numbness, I think, often propels us for seeking the next thrill, the next thing that is to get more of something, to get something else that's going to make us feel good again, rather than sometimes what's needed is to simply stop and reflect on what we have and what that means. This is not exactly the same ballpark, but I've told people this over and over again. I haven't flown as much in the past 3 or 4 years because of COVID, but used to fly, several times a year, going to different places. And to this day, still, almost every time I get on an airplane, there's at some point where I'm sitting on the airplane and I'm just sitting there thinking, this is amazing. I'm sitting here, I'm flying through the air, and this, and I think about my grandparents' life and the people before them and what they had available to them, and I'm sitting and I'm doing this. This is wow. And I think sometimes it's a sense of having that sense of gratefulness and awe about the life that we have been given is part of what helps keep us in balance in terms of the never-ending sense of desire, having to have more and more.
There's a sense of that grounding, that sense of that gratitude of understanding, and I think that puts a lot in context. I'm just a huge fan. I've come to be a believer that one of the key cardinal virtues in life is gratitude, and that if we are grateful people, we just think about all of life differently. Right. And that's a problem. It's hard to be grateful when you feel like you are entitled, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, what materialism is. And you said in our conversation by messaging that that's a slippery term, and it is. So I always said that. I've said in sermons, by the way, I like to ask parishioners over the years, how many sermons have you heard on greed? But yet greed is a huge sin in the Bible. I mean, greed is mentioned. The greed is the second sin mentioned after idolatry. Right. More than anything, what we focus on. And in fact, oftentimes the Bible says greed is idolatry because it's self-worship is what it is. Right.
Right. Right.
And so how many sermons do you hear on greed? Well, I would preach on greed. I've done it time to time. And I always said first of all, I say that we define materialism as the people who have more than we do, right? So there's always the materialist out there, but they have more than we do. But I can remember one time in another church, I decided, I don't remember what the text was for the morning, but it was something on greed and possessions. And I decided I was going to do something I never did and had done before. And I, near the end of my sermon, said, so let me make some suggestions about how we can focus less on stuff in our lives, right? And I started to get really specific, like instead of having 2 car payments, why don't you buy 1 used car and pay cash and then give the difference for missions, right? So I'm just kind of going down the, and I didn't say you, I said we.
Right. Yeah.
What can we do what can we do? So, as a pastor, you almost every Sunday people come out and they'll say that was a very thoughtful sermon, or thank you for that sermon, or I really enjoyed that, which I never know really what that means, but they would thank you for the sermon. Not one person came out that day and said anything about the sermon.
Right. Because
call it greed, call it materialism. Let's just call it stuff. Yeah. Stuff hits us where we live.
Yeah.
And it's real easy, by the way, for me to sit in the pew and listen to hear a sermon about someone else's temptations and sins. A little tough when it's like hitting me at home. Yeah. It's just a sign of where we are, that this is a really uncomfortable subject that people, Christians, don't really want to touch too much.
Well, and I think it was Henry Allan who talked in one of his books about doing counseling with people. Yeah. And he said people come into counseling and they probe all these different issues. And he says people would openly, without reservation, discuss the most intimate matters of their sex lives and, things that they were struggling with. And then he would ask them how much money they made in the course of, and you the arms crossed, it's like, why are you getting into that? Our finances, our material status, for many of us, is very central to our identity. And I think it goes back to another conversation we had a few times back about how the church fails business people. And I think in that one, we talked about how in the culture and the church, we compartmentalize. Church is something that happens over here. My work life and how I manage my money, my assets, and so on, is something that occurs over here. Never the two shall meet. Yeah. Don't start putting those two things together. And so I think when we start trying to have honest conversations about money and about resources and so on, we don't have the resources mentally and the experience to know how to navigate those waters. And I think for some people, it may not be that they resent what's being said, but they are totally freaked out because they have no ground to stand on. They
have no ground to stand on, and they don't realize. I mean, and again, the Bible is replete with conversations about wealth and and stuff and poverty, and we need to be careful to say here again what we've said in previous episodes. It's not a straight line to what the Bible talks about in reference to wealth, to government policy or business policy. So let's be careful. Right. But it's in the equation when we think about these things. When I tell people over the years, having gone to Cuba for a decade and a half now, to teach pastors in the Methodist church there, in order to join the church, I mean, everybody's welcome to attend, but if you want actual united membership with the church, you have to tithe. That's a requirement. I mean, these people are poor, right? That retirement is to tithe. And by the way, you walk into any Methodist church in Cuba, and somewhere inside the building, in the sanctuary or going into it, there's a hanging on the wall of some kind that lists everybody's giving. Yeah. Wow. It's public. And when I say that in groups, you can watch the color drain out of everybody's face. Yeah. Because we want to say, well, it's between us and God. Okay, fair enough. I get that. Right. But what Jesus is trying to say when he talks about that is don't be the wealthy person who gives, $75,000 a year and then brag about it. That's
Right.
not the point. Is so what we do is we want it to be private because, frankly, let's be honest, we'd be a little bit embarrassed,
Right.
if
Yes.
if we knew. And so we tell the cover story that it's just between us and God, but
Right.
really we really just want it to be between me and nobody else,
Right.
because we don't want people to know. And by the
Yeah.
way, I also know that in the church in America, if you start doing that, you're going to have a problem. So I'm not suggesting we do that, but I think it's an
Right.
instructive story for
Right.
how we view these things.
Yeah. And I'll just add a little footnote to that. I don't know how you dealt as a pastor in terms of knowing members and how much money they were giving in terms of what came in with finances. I was the church treasurer for a couple different churches and places. And so I was the one who recorded all the money that would come in. And I think a lot of people would be shocked at how many, particularly low income people, are giving out of their poverty, give such considerable amounts, and how many people that are making tens and tens of thousands of dollars and give $400 over the course of a year for the service of this church.
Right.
And yet deference is given to those people that have the money in the church because they're perceived as being somehow more successful. They're the ones who are probably funding the church. It's not, I don't want to make a complete blanket statement, both ways, that's the way that it is with every person who's in either wealthy or poor. But more of that happens than I think a lot of people appreciate in the church.
Yeah, no, I would say that's true. Pastors, and there's nothing in our discipline that tells Methodist pastors we can't know the giving. But
Right.
I that was just not a hill I wanted to die on.
Right.
So I never really did anything with that. But I'll tell you two stories. The first was this was in the same church I served. I was associate pastor. The pastor gave me a list one day of the top 10 givers of this church. And it was a suburban church. You had a lot of professional people who made a lot more money than I did, although I certainly wasn't complaining about what I made.
Right.
And he showed me the top 10 amounts without names. So I had no idea who it was. I was like number 6.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. Yeah.
And it just shook me because I knew that there were people, a lot of people there making a lot more than I was.
Right.
In a year. Of course, we tithed.
Right.
And the second is a person who was a business executive. I knew he made a 6-figure salary. This was 30 years ago, so it was a lot more than it is now. Certainly, probably still a lot more. He's making a 6-figure salary plus bonuses, and he nailed me before worship. Such a nice thing to do. Really unhappy about the direction the church was taking, and said, right there, he said to me, if things don't change, I'm going to stop giving my $1,000 a year.
Yeah.
Like that was a huge amount of money, knowing that this guy was taking home,
Yeah.
But just, that was just huge. So again, a lot of times there's just no resources to think about this. By the way, you know who I blame for that? I blame the clergy. Yeah. Because we don't do a good job for the most part teaching on stewardship. We do the annual, what I call sermon on the amount. And we've got the budget, and here it is, and here's what we need. And we just do a terrible job of trying to help people, catch them up in this great narrative of what God is doing for the world through our congregation, and the privilege it is to be called into it. And by the way, ministry takes money. It's just the truth.
Right.
I mean, we're the clergy. We're the ones that are at fault for this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a codependency going on there. I think the clergy is often, well, and to be fair, I think most people who become pastors, they have not had a lot of training in finances or don't understand how businesses work and what's going on there. So part of the challenge for, I think, many people who become clergy is they don't have solid ground to stand on. They feel ambivalent and conflicted about how to approach the issue because it hasn't been part of their experience and training either. So I think it falls in multiple different directions. But yes, the fact that it doesn't occur, and that the pastor is the one who's supposed to be the spiritual leader trying to create these, as we talked about before, courageous conversations. Yeah, to some degree, I think you have to say some of the challenges there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk. Let's move into the freedom of simplicity. So, Richard Foster wrote this wonderful book, and by the way, I know a lot of our listeners have read him, but if you've not, you need to read him. His stuff's really good.
Right.
But I, as I said to you before we went on, I was looking for my copy and I can't find it. So,
Yeah.
so somebody probably borrowed it, and their library is less simple
Right.
now. But you reread it last week, and so
Yeah.
so let you start this conversation about what is Foster saying in this book, Freedom of Simplicity. Simplicity.
Right. And I remember it's been a few years ago. I think he did a video series that was based on this book, like a 4-part video series. And he talked about some of the things. And in some ways, I liked the video series better than the book because I thought he gave some very engaging metaphors and ideas that were fun to think about. And the one that has always stuck with me is that he talks about, if you take a piece of string and you place it on a table, and I tell you to put it into a straight line and do it using only one finger, you're going to take that string and, you might keep trying to push it around and trying to get it pushed into the right. You're never going to get it into a straight line by trying to push on various parts of the string. However, if you put your finger on one end of the string and begin to pull that across the table, everything will pull into line right behind it. And the analogy that he's referring to is that so much of our energy goes into, well, am I being too materialistic? Am I spending too much? Or am I being too chintzy and not engaging in life enough? And so we figure, well, maybe we need to do more. Maybe we need to do less here. And so you're always pushing and pulling on these various pieces of our spirituality. But God is not at the center of the focus. Who is God? What is the heart of God? How do I make my heart seek after God? And how do I seek to have God's mind? So when I seek that, all the other pieces fall in behind it. And I think it was him who used the analogy of if our challenge, we're trying to lose weight, and our challenge is hot fudge sundaes because we really love hot fudge sundaes. If we go to bed at night and we pray, and our prayer goes something like, God, please deliver me from hot fudge sundaes, because hot fudge sundaes are my greatest weakness. And if I see hot fudge sundaes, I'll just have to eat them. And I need deliverance from hot fudge sundaes, because if I don't get deliverance from hot fudge sundaes, I'm never going to. So when you're done with that prayer, what's your thought on hot fudge sundaes? Because you're focused on, on that, instead of saying, God, make me whole. Make my heart desire for you. Teach me the things that I can do that will make me whole, that will fill those things that I use other things to fill. Right. And how can I be? And so then the focus becomes, how can I become like God? How can the disciplines that will take me that direction, rather than focus on materialism versus minimalism? All these things that are often what I would say are polarities. I've used that term before. Talked about the act of breathing is both inhaling and exhaling. Which do you prefer more? Right. Well, you're dead if you're not doing both. Right. And in a sense, I think there's that balance of excess of being consumed by trying to have too much, but there can also be sort of conspicuous consumption. Yeah. There can also be conspicuous minimalism too. Oh, where we try to feel pride and to feel spiritual by denying ourselves stuff. Yeah. And that's not healthy either. No, and that's right. So the question then is, where is that yin and yang balance between those two things? And what I appreciated so much about his work in this book is that he says simplicity is singleness of focus. That's the definition of simplicity, and that has stuck with me over the years. Fewer spiritual truths to me have stuck with me stronger than that one and proved themselves over the years.
Well, I believe that Foster had a good teacher. I think somebody once said, "Where your treasure is, that's where your heart is."
There you go.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
This is what
Right.
Jesus says, and so you know we you speak of compartmentalization, Michael. We all like to compartmentalize what we believe from what we do. We like to say, well, that's not really who I am. The fact that I, can't avoid hot fudge sundaes and have 3 of them a day
Yeah.
doesn't mean that I'm a glutton, right?
Right.
Doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
And so we all do this. And you could pick the problem, and we could find examples. But Jesus, and I think the Bible itself kind of gets to the heart of that who we are and what we do are really intertwined and wrapped up together.
Yes. Right.
We can't distinguish that. A husband who beats his wife and continues to say, "I'm sorry, I do love you." Well, maybe he's got some affection for her or some kind, but that's hardly the way of love, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I just, I just think we're good at this. I just think that we're good at divorcing and maybe it's because we like to give ourselves an A for good intentions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is freedom and simplicity, isn't there? I mean, there is.
Yes.
The Bible's onto something. That
Right.
stuff can complicate.
Yeah.
And when Carol and I moved in 2016 from Akron to Ashland, where we live now, our 2 daughters were married and having children. They had been out of the house for a while, and our 2 boys lived with us at the time, and they were college age. And when we were coming to Ashland, they decided not to go with us. They were going to stay in the Akron area. And so Carol and I, we bought a house, and we bought a smaller house that suits us just fine. And we've got an acre of land, which is what we really wanted. And we've got a couple of outbuildings. And we just said, you know what? I at that point, I was having lots of friends who were my age or older who were dealing with their estates of their parents, and just
Right.
where, they saved everything. And I just said, Carol and I talked and said, we're not doing that to our kids.
Yeah.
And so we had stuff we weren't taking. We put it in a section of the basement. I said, before we move, you go through it, you take what you want, and everything else we're good. We're given somewhere. And it was really interesting. So I learned 2 things, Michael. First of all, much to my disbelief, things that I thought were important that my kids they didn't want. There was very little, in fact, that they wanted. Exactly. Right?
Yep.
And the second thing that I realized is that after you get rid of it, you don't miss it. And I said, so it inspired me actually to write a blog post entitled, if you're lucky, your memories will all end up at Goodwill.
There you go.
Because,
that's right.
Because it's stuff, and Carol and I not to have that stuff, and we're hoping, by the way, that when we're gone, we will have simplified our kids' lives by not having all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you just this story. I think I'm okay to share this without having asked my dad's permission, but he, a few years ago, moved into a retirement community, which meant he had to downsize considerably. My mother had died just a few years before. And so he had to move into a retirement community. And he tells the story about how he had lived in China for a year. He'd been back for visits for multiple months and been there and lived in a small room that graduate students that were at the university he was at would live in, and had very minimal stuff there. And he talked about how he didn't miss the stuff that he had at home, when he was having those experiences in China. So he was sort of, I think, congratulatory towards himself that he didn't have all this attachment to stuff. But then when it came time and he's ready to move into this retirement community, and he's got to go through the house, and here's this sofa that they spent years saving up money to buy, and it's probably going to go to the dump, because nobody wants this style of sofa anymore. He's going through filing cabinets, all of his research papers, that he was a research scientist. Yeah. All these research papers, these accomplishments he had, patents that he had done, and publications that he'd gotten. Nobody wants that. And so all this stuff that he had worked so hard on, he's taking out a filing cabinet, putting it in a trash can, And he said, is probably one of the most difficult things that he'd done in his life, even though he's had that temporary experience of being away from it all, and that sense that how much of his identity was wrapped up in that stuff. He's glad he did it. He's glad he got to the other side of it. But again, it just shows how hard it is to get ourselves distance from the stuff that is entangled in our lives that defines us, and to really pull it out, hold it out separate from us, and reflect on the impact that it's having from us. And that's why it has to be continuous effort, spiritual discipline to do that. Yeah.
And don't you think in that case with your dad, it wasn't so much the stuff itself, but everything it meant for his life.
Exactly.
This was his life. He had built a life as a research scientist, and he opened up those files, and that was his life. That's what he had done. That's what's tough. It's always said that the big problem with change is not change in and of itself, it's loss. That there's lots of change that comes into our lives that we love, that we accept. It's the change that involves loss that is so hard for us.
Yes. And I always think of this story that Tony Campolo told years ago. He says, you talk about the family that has kids that are growing up, and you have a son who's finished high school and he's gone off to college. It's the first semester that the son's away, and about a week before Thanksgiving, he calls up and says, "Hey, Mom and Dad, how are things going?" You have this conversation, and he says, "Well, there's a couple of friends here who want to go skiing over Thanksgiving, and I think I'm going to go skiing with them, in Colorado this year." And the parents say, "Well, okay, they don't object." But then when you get to the Thanksgiving table and everybody's sitting there and the usual conversations are going on, and he says, at some point in that meal, there'll be a pall that will fall over the conversation, because this son isn't there. He's gone. The world that they created has changed. And he says, you say, "Well, it's not the end of the world." And he says, "Yeah, it is. It's the end of the world they created. It's the end of the world that gave meaning to it." And that's painful. But they don't hold that against their son, because he's growing up. This is what they raised him to do. He's going to leave. It's going to be different. Things are going to change. But that doesn't mean that change is painless. And so that's, I think, the ability to change those. And I think it was Henry Allan that talked about our life is basically a process of giving up everything that we have to God, and ultimately at the end, giving up our whole life so that he returns back to us that and more that he gave us in this life. And so if we look at each of these processes of giving up things as a spiritual practice that we are giving up to God, who's going to return to us. So,
I had that same experience when our children were to the place. One of the most important things for me when our children were at home was vacation time, and we take a couple weeks in the summer and go to the beach or whatever. And that was so important to me because my schedule was pretty hectic being a pastor. And I'll never forget the last vacation we took. Our daughters by that time were right around 20 or so years old, and they didn't want to be there. They did not want to be on vacation. They had other stuff they wanted to do. And I forced them to come, and, we had fun, but a little bit of miserable fun. And finally, we were sitting in the house we had rented in Wilmington, North Carolina one night. We were talking, and I had realized exactly that. The problem for me was the loss, right?
Yeah.
And that I finally said to the girls, and the boys were younger at the time, so they were still, but I said to the girls, "This is the last vacation that we are going to require you to go on. That you're always welcome to go with us, but you don't have to go." And it was that was a real adjustment for me.
Sure.
But here's the interesting thing. Now my daughters are married, and we've got 4 grandchildren. And every other year, all of us, children and grandchildren, take a vacation together somewhere.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's right. There you go.
You say God gives back more, and I think, but there's an intangible about that, isn't there? There's a blessing about that it just doesn't boil down to stuff. I mean, it just doesn't boil down to stuff.
Right. Yeah. And the memories, the relationships, the connections, those are the things that last and hold value when you hit the twilight years of your life. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And as you know, as we get older, that really becomes more important. I can remember when I was a kid and wanted everything, and I'd hear older folks say stuff like that. "Oh, the only gift I have is is that we're just all together. You know, now
Yeah,
I'm 12
yeah.
years old going, really? Seriously?
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to aim higher, you know? And that's what I say now.
Yeah.
I got all
Yeah.
my family on Christmas Day. What more do I want? Is really
Exactly.
a gift you can get me? Nah, this is good. I'm
Yeah.
glad with this. Well, Michael,
Yeah.
we're coming to time. Let me ask you this. So Christmas season is upon us, and we're engaged in the gift buying and gift giving and celebrating God's self-giving to us in Jesus.
Right.
What would be, if you could offer any advice to us, knowing that, you know, there's no rules here on this, and there's no, or I should say, there's no standard 10-point, you know.
Right. Yeah.
How can we celebrate this holiday, recognizing the importance of gift giving and being generous toward others and all that, but how do we keep it in perspective as the followers of Jesus who know that the Bible says to us, the stuff of this world and how we treat it and what we do with it matters?
Yeah. Yeah. I still come back, and it's kind of where we began the conversation of approaching life and approaching the world with gratitude. And I would add to that, I think also approaching it with a sense of joy. The difficulty between how much is too materialistic and how much is being too ascetic and that kind of thing is a issue that needs to be struggled with. But I think it needs to be struggled with from a standpoint of joy, because we're never going to get it perfect. We're never going to get it right, exactly right. But God loves us anyway, and God is bringing us along. God is working in us, and so let's struggle with that. But let's do it out of a sense of gratitude and joy in our struggle with that we even have this to struggle with.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And so I really think it's an issue of being grateful to God and making sure that we keep our focus on God, pulling that string
Yeah.
across the table with God at the front. And the other stuff will fall into its place eventually, and it will look imperfect and messy as we're doing it. But don't stress over that.
Yeah.
God will be with us. God will work it out. Yeah.
Good advice. I am reminded as you say all of that of one of my favorite quotes from Marcus Aurelius. When you arise in the morning, think of what a joy it is to breathe, to think, to love.
Yeah.
And that is true. And
yeah.
you know, you and I got up this morning, and God didn't know this to us. He didn't know us this day, but it's here as a gift. And so,
right.
Let's enjoy it. And yeah. Good words. All right. Well, Michael, thank you as always for the great conversation. And we'll pick up next month, December, the last program that we'll have for 2022. And maybe we'll think about, maybe we should talk about what do we thought were the big news stories of last year, or the big things that happened, and what do we think are going to be big in 2023?
Yeah.
You know, let's just prognosticate and get our lunch handed to us. Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, we could do something else too. Doesn't matter.
But as Yogi Berra said, you know, predictions are hard, especially about the future. So
you know, I listen. I made a living. I've made a living as a pastor quoting Yogi Berra. So written sermons. So that works out. All right, my friend. Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been good. Friends, we thank you for joining us. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan Bevere. A reminder that the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. And so I say to all of you, keep seeking and have a great day.
Bye-bye.